Down there, over here in the back.
Yeah, my name is Gordon Nichols. You mentioned the horticultural heritage and gathering dust. Is it likely to resurface, or is there something that can be done to get that up? We've had some great recommendations.
A website where you can get access to it.
Oh, I've read it. It's great.
Yeah.
Well,
So you'd like to see it dusted up?
you know, I mean, there's going to be a federal election in a few months. Make it an issue.
I think, if I could follow that up, one of the frustrations that I see with the media democratization movement is that there is existing regulations and there are existing, the CRTC, if the community channel was living up to what the CRTC says it should be, that would be a vital public good. So, the infrastructure is there, the policy is there, but the public isn't pushing the CRTC to make it happen. The activists you mentioned, they fought really hard and were able to get back on the air locally. So I think there's stuff already in place that, with the right strategic approach, could actually be leveraged into something effective. I see our cultural heritage that way as well.
Well done. Over here.
I think that with the internet, sometimes city governments have been able to intervene and turn the results really good. So, because I think the focus often is on the national and the global. So I know that I think in Philadelphia they have Wi-Fi, and I think they have it in New Zealand and the Vancouver City Council right now has it as part of its policy platform. So I wonder sometimes if you just need to focus. I mean, I know that's an important realm for sure, but there are ways that cities can intervene and to access citizens. It's a little bit closer to us and stuff. Because I'm going to
Sure.
have experience of that.
Yeah, well, we still have the capacity with the internet to decide how we want to use it. It hasn't been completely colonized yet. And again, that's why the policy issues are important. If we were here in 1910, we'd be talking about radio, and you'd be saying, yeah, but, don't worry about the commercial networks, because I can get on the radio and I can communicate with my friends, and we can do this and we can do that. And then, at a certain point, and historians can pinpoint it, radio was no longer a means of communication. That's it. It became a means of selling goods with the little public service space carved out. Okay? And so, is that where we're at with the internet today? If 10 years from now, what are we going to be saying with regard to the internet? So we have to make it a political issue now.
Over here.
Darrell Evans, BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. I just wanted to add a dimension to something you said earlier about regulation of the internet or the activities of the federal government around the internet away from Industry Canada and put them somewhere else. What I wanted to say is, it's because of Industry Canada that we now have privacy legislation in Canada for the private sector. And it's a very convoluted thing. I'm always looking for where are the opportunities to create change, being an activist. And they come from the oddest places sometimes. Privacy legislation, both federally and on a provincial basis, it was sold on the basis that if Canada wants to lead in e-commerce, we had to create privacy legislation like it had in Europe. Because if we want to have e-commerce with Europe, we have to harmonize with their privacy legislation. So Industry Canada actually became the lead for the creation of this privacy legislation, which is enormous, decades ahead of the United States. So sometimes you get an odd opportunity. That's the basis on which we sold it. So now we have privacy regulation for the private sector. Provinces had to leap in because if they didn't get their legislation, if they didn't create their own legislation, the federal legislation would have come to effect in the province. So I'm trying to find out where are the opportunities for activism here. All I can see is that if you hired someone for a year, gave them some money, they could tie all these people who are concerned about these issues into a tremendous force. Like Council for Canadians or something like that. In this area, I just feel all the interest there is and all the people who are so concerned. But it just takes that, where do you get that, even that 1 year of funding for someone who's actually then just, or go around and organize some of these good things.
There's a project.
That's a project, right? How does it come about? How does it come about? It's really, you said, what is the problem in Canada? As you know, one of us, you know, a few dozen maybe struggling activist groups, it's extremely difficult to get an activist group off the ground in Canada.
Well, anywhere, I would say.
Yeah, well,
Canada.
but there's so much money for them in the United States. I mean, there's no comparison.
Well, I suspect that if Graham Spry were here, he and Alan Plott would probably plot something. And the interesting thing is, I think the grounds are shifting. I think the target has changed. In other words, in his day and age, it was a fairly simple thing to target the members of Parliament, to target legislation, and to pull together a coalition of general interest, largely general interest groups like the Association of Canadian Clubs, for example, or the Corbett and the Adult Education Society is so powerful. Today, no question that we have far more single-issue interest groups around the community. And as already been mentioned, the levels of government are far more complex than they have been before. We cannot just target Ottawa. We have to target the provinces who are assuming more and more spending in cultural areas. And we also have to target the municipalities, which in British Columbia are, in fact, the biggest cultural spenders ever. So maybe there are arguments, kind of like the World Bank kind of arguments. You use the Livelihood Ministry Canada against them, and you talk about capacity building and network building, and you go to Infrastructure Canada. But there has been there are a number of different alternatives. But certainly there needs to be a sort of hothouse think tank with activists to figure out where the strategy may go next.
Mm-hmm. Right on.
I think we have time for a few more questions. Maybe we should turn to the pretty place. Okay.
Heather Morrison, that actually ties right into what I'm thinking, which is what is the advocacy strategy? And I'm not thinking how do we get the money, how do we get the people, but what are the key things that we do to get across that the internet should be a public good, that we should continue to communicate, and how do we get across to our government that democratic processes should be come into play in these sorts of things.
Well, I mean, you're asking really big questions. I mean, how do we get this, how do we get this on the board? I mean, what is the strategy? How does one advocate? You have to start at ground up. I mean, you have to work with what is there. I mean, an issue comes up and you have to get in there, and you have to build coalitions, and you have to find the people who are on the same page as you, and you've got to go for it. I mean, I don't have a recipe for that. I'm sorry. I wish I did, but I don't. I think, Darryl, is it? You said, you asked, how does one advocate? I mean, I hear that you're doing it. I mean, you're doing it, and it gets back to something I said in the talk. At some levels, we're a very complacent society. So people say, "Oh yeah, these are the privacy people." So we look like a single interest group, and there's no simple answer to it. I mean, one of the interesting things, and one of the reasons I got involved in the World Summit on the Information Society, is because it promised at a certain level to raise the profile of the issues. And interestingly, as I mentioned in the talk, for 4 years, all those newspapers that I mentioned didn't publish a line on it. And now all of a sudden they came in because the United States State Department, through its own contacts, let it be known that there was a real threat out there. The UN was going to get involved and take this out of our hands. And all of a sudden, they were interested. I don't know what we can do about that. But to the extent that these issues do come into public consciousness, and that people do begin to understand that they are important and that they're worth investing in and worth organizing around and putting energy into, I mean, that's the only way that there can be any hope for change.
in addition to your association, I'm just going to come back to British Columbia. Our BC Library Association is phenomenal. It's phenomenal. And the other thing is that we have a potential ally and asset in the BC Teachers Federation as well. But there is no explicit provincial program on media literacy or democratic communication at all, starting at very junior age.
We wrote the IRPs, but they just keep getting diluted.
Yeah.
In Ontario, you can't graduate without media
So
literacy.
you need that. And the last thing I'm going to say is that provincially, we're sitting on a tremendous asset. Don't ask me how, but Mr. Campbell's cabinet was stared down on the issue of privatizing Knowledge Network, at least for the moment. The Knowledge Network alone has 20,000 members around the province, ironically stronger outside of the Greater Vancouver regional area. And they're a tremendous asset, potentially, around issues of this sort, were knowledge to be taken the direction, taken public, if you like, for the province.
And the greatest organization that I know of on this planet when it comes to taking corporations to task in terms of their brands is Adbusters. My favorite field trip is to take 30 grade 7s or grade 11s into a studio for a tour, then sit down and negotiate the airtime for a 30-second attack on couch potatoes. And to me, the CBC, it was a greater catastrophe when the Supreme Court ruled that they did not have to air Adbusters Greenpeace ads. I just cannot believe it. To me, whatever it is, but $250 million in tax dollars and 250 commercial revenue, that $1.25 billion is being stolen from the citizens and laid at the feet of the other 250 million. What are we doing? We've got no public broadcast if all that matters is Pirelli tires and Toyota.
I'm going to ask my colleague, Dr. Hackett, to just make a few remarks, and then I really do think I should make a movement to continue the conversation in the nice room. Okay.
Thank you, Heather. The one thing I did want to add was that we do have here in Vancouver something called an annual Media Democracy Day, which is also held in Toronto, and 1 year was held around the world, actually, through the auspices of the indie media centers. And that's something that people could get involved in. I mean, anything that can be to it is held in the Vancouver Library each year. And it occurs to me, we can actually use this occasion right here to get that revitalized. It does need some more energy and new people injected into it. I don't know, Denise, if we have the capacity to take people's email addresses right now, so that at least they could be on a list for announcing that.
We should set up a list.
Yeah.
But I was thinking you were going to raise the fact that Bob is trying to attract the Worldwide Union for Democratic Communication conference here in Vancouver, which would be the 70s, and it will be in 2007. And the school will be involved, right?
We hope so, yeah. The timing is indeterminate now. They had to cancel the November conference because of the hurricane. So we obviously, it's been in limbo, but hopefully in 2007 we will be hosting the Union for Democratic Communication, and there's a possibility we have a good deal of grassroots media activism in Vancouver, maybe bring that together with the conference.
What I'll do is set up a book for those people who are quite interested in trying to join some sort of an email list, as Bob has suggested. And we'll talk to you, of course, I'm really nervous because the Privacy Association is here. We'll talk to you about what we'll do with the list eventually, but we'll let you know on future events.
Sign up as consent.
Sign up as consent. I'm nervous about anything now about this. Time for one last question. Anything burning? Well, then I'm going to thank Marc there. Obviously galvanizing, so thank you very much. We have a small token of our appreciation, Marc. Thank you so much, sir.